Chayton was already on the verge of collapse when the government doctor entered the Lakota home and said, without hesitation, that the boy would be taken to the fort immediately. The fever was consuming his body, and every second seemed to matter. The mother didn't argue. She simply stood in front of her son, firm, blocking any approach. The doctor lost his patience and snapped that the boy would die there, that this wasn't care, that this was exactly why the government was trying to teach those people how to live the right way. The silence grew heavy. Outside, 2 soldiers waited. Thomas Hale watched everything from the doorway. He was the volunteer teacher sent to that reservation to teach English to Lakota children after the government had decided to take away their language, their culture, everything they were. Until that moment, he believed he was helping. But then everyone looked at him, as if the decision were his. Thomas felt the weight of it and realized that maybe he didn't understand anything about the people he thought he was there to teach. And it was in that moment that everything began to change. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our work. Then go to the comments and tell us which city or country you're watching this video from. Let's get into the story right after the intro.
Indigenous West Stories.
The year was 1879. The American government had just made official what had been happening informally for decades, the forced assimilation of indigenous peoples through education. The logic was cold, precise, and dressed in the language of civilization. If the Lakota could not be destroyed by weapons, they would be destroyed by schoolrooms. Children would be removed from their families, forbidden from speaking their language, stripped of their names, prevented from practicing their ceremonies. Those who disobeyed would be punished. General Richard Pratt had summarized the entire policy in a single sentence that would follow American. History like a shadow. Kill the Indian, save the man. Thomas Hale had read that sentence. He had not flinched. This is not because Thomas was cruel. It is because cruelty, when it wears the costume of progress, rarely announces itself as cruelty. Thomas genuinely believed the way a man believes in gravity, the way he believes the sun will rise, that what he was offering these children was a gift. English, literacy, a path into the future. He had been raised by a pastor father and a school teacher mother in central Pennsylvania, surrounded by books and hymns and the steady certainty that America was a civilizing force in a world that needed civilizing. He had studied pedagogy. He knew how to reach children. He had volunteered for this mission not out of malice, but out of something almost more dangerous, sincere, unexamined goodness. He arrived at the Lakota reservation in early autumn, when the grass was still golden and the air had that particular clarity that exists only on the edge of seasons. He stepped off the supply wagon with his trunk, his blackboard, his lesson plans, and a specific kind of confidence that belongs to people who have never been truly lost. The schoolroom was a single wooden structure near the edge of the reservation, smelling of pine resin and old smoke. The benches were rough cut. The windows were small. 31 children arrived on the first morning, some brought by parents, some brought by the quiet coercion of government agents. They ranged in age from 6 to 14. They sat down. They looked at Thomas Hale, and Thomas Hale looked back at them and felt, for just a moment, the first faint tremor of something he could not name. They were not hostile. He had prepared himself for hostility. He had packed patience for hostility, strategies for hostility, theological frameworks for overcoming hostility with kindness. But this was not hostility. It was indifference. Not the bored indifference of children in a comfortable classroom who would rather be playing outside. This was something older and more complete. Their eyes were present, fully present, but they were watching him the way you watch weather, not as a threat, not as a wonder, as a phenomenon, as something happening in the world that concerned them very little. Thomas began with the alphabet. He wrote each letter on the blackboard with precise, teacher-trained strokes. He said the sounds aloud. The children repeated them when asked. Their pronunciation was accurate. Their faces were unchanged. He told a story about a boy named James who went to school and learned to read, and his life was transformed. The children listened. Their faces were unchanged. He drew pictures on the board, a house, a horse, a tree. He said the English words. The children repeated them. Their faces were unchanged. He went back to his quarters that first evening and wrote in his diary that the children showed promise and that progress would come with time. By the end of the second week, he was not sleeping well. He tried new methods, games that involved movement, because he had read that physical engagement improved retention, songs with simple English words, stories with drawings. He made a small puppet from fabric and gave it an English name and used it to demonstrate conversations. Some of the younger children watched the puppet with mild interest. But the invisible wall, that particular impenetrable quality of their attention, did not shift. And then there was Chaitin. Chaitin was 8 years old. He was small for his age, with dark eyes that had the unsettling quality of seeming to register everything without reacting to any of it. He sat in the middle of the room. He learned English at a speed that would have alarmed Thomas if he had been paying attention to the right things. Within 3 weeks, Chaitin could form complete sentences. Within a month, he could read simple passages aloud with a fluency that exceeded children twice his age. But Chaitin did not use his English to answer questions. He used it to ask them. On a Tuesday morning in the 5th week, Thomas was explaining a passage from the primer, a simple text about American geography, about the states, about the great expanding nation, and Chaitin raised his hand. Thomas called on him. "Why does the map on the wall show our land with a different name?" Thomas looked at the map. It was a standard government-issue map of the Dakota Territory. He explained that territories had official names, that the government used these names for administrative purposes. Who gave the land that name? Thomas said that it had been named as part of the process of organizing the territory. Chaitin said nothing more, but his eyes held Thomas for a moment before returning to his primer. The following week, during a lesson about American history that covered the founding of the nation, the principles of liberty and self-determination, the courage of men who had refused to be governed. Without representation, Chaitin raised his hand again. "You said these men were brave because they did not want someone else to decide how they should live. Is that why they took our land? Because they did not want someone else to decide how they should live?" Thomas told Chaitin that this was not the appropriate time for that kind of question, that they needed to stay focused on the lesson. That night, Thomas wrote the question in his diary. He stared at it for a long time. Then he closed the diary and tried to sleep and could not. 2 weeks later, during a lesson about civilization, the word itself used approvingly throughout the primer, used as the name for the destination all progress was heading toward, Chaitin raised his hand a third time. "What does civilized mean?" Thomas said it meant living according to certain principles. Order, education, development of society. Does it mean living like you? Thomas said that civilization was a broad concept, not limited to any one group of people. Chaitin looked at him for a moment. "Then why does every picture of a civilized person in this book look like you?" Thomas dismissed the class early that day. He sat alone in the empty schoolroom for a long time. The primer lay open on his desk. He looked at the illustrations Chaitin had described. He had looked at them 100 times and never once seen what Chaitin had seen in 5 weeks. He started going outside more. He told himself it was for fresh air. He told himself he was doing observational research, gathering context that would help him better understand his students. He told himself many things during those weeks in the second month, because the truth of what he was actually doing, the truth that he was drawn to the life happening around him with something approaching hunger, was not a truth he was ready to examine directly. He watched the older men teaching the young boys to track animals across frost-hardened ground, reading signs invisible to Thomas: bent grass, disturbed soil, the direction of a broken branch. He watched women working together with a coordination that required no spoken direction, as if they moved inside a shared understanding that language was too slow to carry. He watched children learning to read the sky, learning the names of stars in a language whose syllables themselves carried meaning, not just sound. He watched old men sit in circles and tell stories. He could not understand the words, but he could see what happened to the faces of the young people listening. He had been trying for weeks to produce that look in his classroom, that specific combination of absorption and recognition, as if the story being told was something they already knew but had forgotten. He had not once produced it. Not once. And then one afternoon in the 6th week, he was sitting near the edge of the camp, writing in his diary, when a presence settled beside him without announcement. He looked up. The man who had sat down beside him was old, deeply geologically old, with a face that had been shaped by decades of sun and wind into something that looked more like landscape than skin. This was Bison Blanco, Tatanka Scar, Chayton's grandfather. Thomas had seen him at a distance several times. He had never spoken to him. The old man had never, as far as Thomas knew, shown any interest in him whatsoever. The old man sat and looked at the horizon for a very long time. Then he said in careful, sparse English that Thomas would later learn had been acquired during years of treaty negotiations and abandoned as useless. "You teach my grandson words, but words without roots fly with the wind." Then he stood up and walked away. Thomas sat there until the light changed. He tried to write the sentence in his diary. He wrote it, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. He could not explain why it had landed in him so heavily. It was not a complicated statement. It was not on its surface a revolutionary idea, but something about the precision of it, words without roots fly with the wind, lodged in him somewhere below the level where his education could reach. He wrote his second monthly report to the government that week. He said the children were advancing. He said English comprehension was developing. He said the mission was proceeding according to plan. He did not write about the questions. He did not write about the old man. He did not write about what he had begun to see when he watched the life of the reservation from the edges. He did not write about the thing growing in him that he had no language for yet. Chayton became ill in the 2nd week of the 3rd month. It began as a fever. By the 2nd day, it had become something more serious. The kind of fever that makes a small body shake, that turns a child's eyes glassy and distant, that makes even experienced adults go quiet with a fear they try to hide from each other. The government doctor arrived, a man named Crawford who wore his authority like a second coat and who spoke to the Lakota as if they were an ongoing inconvenience in his otherwise manageable life. He examined Chayton briefly. He announced that the boy needed to be taken to the medical facility at the fort, where he could be properly treated. Chayton's mother refused, not loudly, not with the kind of refusal that requires witnesses. She simply did not move away from her son. She stood between Dr. Crawford and the boy with a stillness that was not passive. It was a wall. Crawford explained, with the particular condescension of a man who believed that explaining something slowly was the same as explaining it clearly, that the child's life was at risk and that indigenous healing practices could not address a fever of this severity, and that the responsible thing, the civilized thing, was to remove the boy to proper care. Thomas was standing near the doorway of the family's home, having followed the commotion from the schoolhouse. He had no reason to be there. He had no authority over medical decisions. He was a school teacher contracted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to deliver English instruction to children of school age. This was not his situation to enter. He entered it anyway. To this day, and Thomas wrote about this moment more than any other in the decades that followed, trying to understand what had moved him, He could not fully explain the impulse. He said only that when he looked at Chaitan's mother, standing between her sick child and the doctor who had come to take him away, he recognized something. Not politically, not intellectually, something anterior to thought, something that had to do with the particular quality of love that refuses to move. He stepped forward and told Dr. Crawford that he was confident the family's preferred course of treatment should be respected, that as the contracted educational representative, he had observed this family for 2 months and had full confidence in their capacity to care for their child, that he would personally take responsibility for documenting the outcome for the Bureau. Dr. Crawford stared at him for a long moment with an expression that managed to combine contempt with genuine surprise. Then he left. Chaitan's mother looked at Thomas. She did not say thank you. What she gave him was something older than gratitude. It was acknowledgement. The specific look that passes between people when they recognize each other across a gap they had both assumed was uncrossable. That night, when the healer came and the ceremony began, Thomas asked permission to stay. He expected to be told no. He had no real claim to be there, but Chaitan's mother looked at him for a moment and then gestured simply toward a spot near the far wall where he could sit without being in the way. What happened that night undid him, not because it was strange, because it was not strange at all, because the strangeness he had prepared for, the primitive ritual, the superstitious practice, the thing that needed to be gently replaced with progress, was simply not present. What was present was a community. Every person who came through that door brought something, a hand on a shoulder, a voice added to the singing, a presence. The healer worked with herbs that filled the small space, with a smell like deep forest, like earth after rain, like something so old it preceded his entire civilization. The singing was low and rhythmic, not performed but functional, not decoration but structure, as if the sound itself was a form of medicine, as if the community gathered around the boy was itself the treatment. Thomas sat against the far wall and felt something that he would describe in his diary 3 days later, with the hesitant precision of a man trying to name something he has no existing name for, as the most complete thing I have ever witnessed. He had attended church services his entire life. He had heard his father preach. He had sung hymns in 100 congregations. He had participated in the communal rituals of his own civilization his entire life, and none of it, not one moment of it, had ever felt as functionally complete as what he was watching in this small Lakota home in the Dakota Territory in the middle of the night in 1879. He thought about Chaitan's question, "Does civilized mean living like you?" He looked at the boy on the bed, feverish and shaking, surrounded by every member of his community who could fit in the room, held by song and fire and the particular density of love that fills a space when people refuse to let a child face the dark alone. He did not have an answer. Chaitan's fever broke toward morning. The sun was just starting to define the edges of things when Bison Blanco sat beside Thomas again, outside this time, in the blue-gray light before dawn. Both of them exhausted, both of them looking at the horizon that was beginning to separate itself from the sky. The old man was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Now you have seen. The question is what you will do with what you have seen." Thomas did not answer. He did not have an answer yet. He wrote his final report to the government with careful precision. He stated that the children under his instruction had made substantial progress in English language acquisition, that they demonstrated comprehension across reading, writing, and verbal communication, that the educational mission had been fulfilled to the standards required by the Bureau. Everything in the report was true. He had not lied. The children had learned English. The mission on paper had been completed. He did not renew his contract. He requested a transfer back east on the grounds of personal necessity. He packed his trunk. He returned the blackboard to the government storeroom. He said goodbye to the other teachers and the government agents and the administrator who had overseen his appointment, all of whom expressed mild regret and immediately forgot about him. He went to find Chaitin before he left. The boy was recovered, seated outside his family's home, watching a bird perform something complicated in the branches of a nearby tree. Thomas sat beside him. They were quiet together for a moment, comfortable in silence in a way they had not been in the schoolroom, where Thomas had always felt obligated to fill the air with instruction. Thomas gave Chaitin his diary, not the grammar primer, not any of the books from his trunk. His diary, the private one, the one in which he had written Chaitin's unanswerable questions, and the old man's sentence about words and roots, and what he had felt during the night of the ceremony. He had marked a page near the end. On that page, written in the hours after the fever broke, when he was too changed and too awake to sleep, "I came here to open minds." Mine was the one that was opened. Chaitin took the diary. He looked at the marked page. He read the sentence. He looked at Thomas with those dark, still eyes that had been asking questions from the very first day. He did not say, "Thank you," either. What he gave Thomas was a small strip of braided leather, a simple thing, worn, worked between fingers until it was smooth, the kind of object that a culture makes not to display but to hold. Thomas took the train east 3 days later. He returned to Pennsylvania. He taught school for another 30 years in public schools, in communities that never knew where he had spent 3 months in 1879, never knew what had happened to him among the Lakota. He was by all accounts a good teacher. Former students remembered him as unusually patient, unusually attentive to questions, unusually unwilling to dismiss the ideas of children as incorrect simply because they were unexpected. He never spoke about the Dakota Territory, not to colleagues, not to family, not to friends. He married. He had children. He lived a quiet, complete life in the state where he was born, and when he died in 1931, in the town where he had grown up, there was nothing in his obituary about any of it. He was a schoolteacher. He had served his community. He was beloved by those who knew him. Among his possessions, found in the drawer of his writing desk by his daughter after the funeral, was a small strip of braided leather. She had never seen it before. She had no idea what it was or where it had come from. She almost discarded it, but something, some quality, of the way it had been kept, separate from everything else in a small cloth pouch that had itself been carefully maintained, told her it mattered. She kept it. The leather strip survived Thomas by decades. In a family that knew almost nothing of its origin, it passed from the daughter to her children with only the notation that it had belonged to Thomas and that he had kept it for 52 years. 52 years. Across every move, every season, every decade that separated 1879 from the end of his life, Thomas Hale kept a piece of braided leather in a cloth pouch in a desk drawer and told no one what it meant. But he never threw it away. There is a certain kind of transformation that does not announce itself. That does not produce a convert, does not generate a confession, does not result in the dramatic reversal that satisfying stories are supposed to contain. Thomas Hale did not become an activist. He did not dedicate his life to fighting the assimilation policies. He did not write a book or give a speech or take any action that history would record as consequential. He simply went home, and he was different. And the difference lived inside him for 52 years, quiet and permanent, like a river that has changed the shape of a valley so slowly that no one watching could have told you when it happened. Chaitin had asked him 3 questions that Thomas could not answer. Why don't the books mention the Lakota? Why does civilization only look like you? If your founding heroes were brave for refusing to be governed by someone else's rules, what does that make us? Thomas had never answered those questions out loud. But the leather strip in the drawer suggests that the questions never stopped mattering to him. that somewhere in the long quiet of his Pennsylvania life, he held those questions the way you hold something you have been given by someone you could not keep, carefully, privately, without ever quite putting it down. The boy who asked the unanswerable questions had taught the teacher one final lesson, that the most important thing you can give someone is not an answer. It is the question that will not let them rest.